This is Module 4 of Yeshua, the Unknown Jesus, in which we're going to be looking at views of the coming Messiah. Now, there was a concept in ancient Israel called the Day of Yahweh, the Day of the Lord. The early prophets speak of it, and the concept of the Day of Yahweh originally was a day when the God of Israel would come and either save or redeem or restore or exalt the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. In about the 9th century before the Christian era is when we start reading literature that uses this terminology, a time when God would glorify Israel and destroy its enemies. One of the great descriptions that comes later, many centuries later, that devolves from this idea is the description we find in Isaiah of the great banquet that God would provide. On this mountain, Zion, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. And this is part of the earliest revelations and visions, the very positive revelations and visions of the prophet Isaiah. And he predicts or looks forward to the coming of one who was anointed by God to lead his people. It is Isaiah who comes up with the idea that a born dynastic leader, a human child, will be born that will lead Israel and the world into this kind of greatness. In the 9th chapter of Isaiah, he says, For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So this is a very early vision, early on, of the greatness that is in store for not just Israel, but the entire world, all the people through Israel and the God of Israel. However, in many of the earlier prophets, especially the prophets of Israel like Amos, this concept of the day of the Lord becomes a concept of the day of the Lord's judgment. The myth was inverted to one of mishpat, which meant to be for all the debts to be settled up. Divine judgment in condemning the corrupt leadership of Israel. As Amos says, even earlier than the time of Isaiah, Woe unto you that desire the day of Yahweh. What will it mean for you? The day of Yahweh is darkness and not light. Now, after this time, after the Assyrian conquest, the doom that Amos had predicted had come upon Israel, the northern kingdom. And the punishment having been given, the school of Isaiah developed. We have actually 3 different pieces of time or partitions of time when things are written that we find in the modern day book of Isaiah. There's a very old section which we call Proto-Isaiah. There is a section that comes much later we call Deutero-Isaiah, and then finally Trito-Isaiah, chapters 55 or 56 to the end, which hold entirely different language and entirely different visions, much consistent with the glorious visions of the coming of the Lord to glorify Israel and all people. And it's out of that last section, Trito-Isaiah, that we find so much that is quoted or that is used as a basis for things like the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation, book of Revelations. And Trito-Isaiah connects this time with a banquet at an apocalyptic age to come, a time that is to come. And the Messiah, which literally meant the anointed one, who would be an anointed king of Israel, like Samuel had been anointed by the prophet Saul, was actually an historical person who would be awaited to return Israel to its glory. Now, the first Messiah was King Saul. This is in about the 10th century before the Christian era. And he would be the first one anointed with leadership for Israel. But King Hezekiah, who was not the reformer that Josiah was, but who did lead through his piety, led Judea and Judah through the very, very difficult times that were brought upon them by the conquests of the Assyrians that had destroyed Israel. Hezekiah was considered to be the historical Messiah who would return in later prophetic expectation. Now, in about the 6th century before the Christian era, we find that this terminology is being used about expecting the return of Hezekiah. And we find it even used in the Talmudic period. Now, the day of the Lord becomes the idea of a messianic age in the Babylonian school of Daniel, which seems to have taken its cues from Trito-Isaiah. And the day of Yahweh, which is both a day of judgment and a day of exaltation, is conflated with this idea of the age of the coming Messiah in the apocalyptic speculation that we get during the intertestamental period. So I'd like to give you some readings from Ben Zakkai and another rabbi, Bar Kappara, who were Aramaic-speaking rabbis of the first Christian century. That is, they were contemporaries of Jesus. Now, let me explain that Yochanan ben Zakkai was the head of the Pharisaic school in Jerusalem when the great war arose in the AD 70s that the Zealots and others had raised up against the Romans, that ended up in the surrounding of the city of Jerusalem and the starving out of its people. It was a terrible disaster. And eventually the Zealots and the were going to have everybody die. They would rather everyone died than capitulate to the Romans. But the Roman blockade was stopping food and very little water from getting in, and people were in such a horrible shape after a certain amount of time that they were actually eating the dead bodies of their relatives. There are terrible descriptions of this about in the AD 70s. This is what was predicted by Yeshua, by Jesus, this terrible time that people should flee to the mountains and so on. And his people had done that. They had left the city when they saw this coming. Now, Ben Zakkai realized that the nation of Israel was dead and any hopes for it at this point, but he wanted to preserve the traditions of Israel and the scriptures of Israel. So he had his disciples, according to a legend, put him into a kind of a casket, and they asked permission to carry his body outside of the city and bury it. And this was a ruse in order to get them to speak to the Roman general who was holding the city captive. And in order to get him out of the city, he was pretended to be dead, and as they went through the Roman guards, the guards stuck their spears into the casket to make sure he was, and probably injured him quite a bit. But they brought the old man out, and he spoke to, I believe it was it Vespasian or Titus? I guess it was Vespasian, who gave him permission to start a rabbinic school. The condition being it would not be politically based, it would simply be for the carrying on of the religion of Judaism in a city called Jamnia, or Jabnia as it's called in some places. And so the school of Rabbi Ben Zakkai was established there peacefully and allowed to exist by the Romans after they had crushed Jerusalem and taken it over. And it was there that Pharisaic and Rabbinic Judaism was born. It was there that it was decided which books of the Jewish scripture would become the Bible. And it was there that the whole foundation was laid for modern Rabbinic Judaism. Now, Ben Zakkai is one of the great, great saints of Judaism. So just before his death, it is said in the Talmudic literature that he turned to his disciples and said, "Remove all vessels, lest they be rendered unclean, and prepare a throne for Hezekiah, king of Judea, who is come." So King Hezekiah, whom the rabbis held in highest regard as defender and champion of the Torah, was regarded by some of them as the Messiah. The word Hezekiah means the strength and the power of God. This is probably what Rabbi Hillel, who was associated with the Babylonian school, meant when he said, "Israel no longer need expect the Messiah, for he was already consumed," which means he already appeared in the days of Hezekiah. So if we now look at another teacher, Ben Kapara of Sepphoris, the city where Jesus would have spent a lot of his time working and building with his father, Ben Kapara says that this belief was held by some of his colleagues, and I'm quoting again from the Talmud, "The Lord wished to make Hezekiah Messiah, but justice protested and said, 'Master of the universe, David, king of Israel, who sang so many songs and praises unto thee, thou didst not make Messiah. Hezekiah, in whose behalf thou hast already performed so many miracles, and who did not sing praises unto thee, wilt thou make him Messiah?'" So there was definitely a clear idea that the Messiah was coming, and he was, so to speak, a reincarnation of Hezekiah. Now, Ben Zakkai, who died about a decade after the destruction of the temple, and somewhere in the years of the 80s, the decade of the 80s in the Christian era, expected the Messiah in the immediate future. And those expectations were eventually built up again with dependence upon the star prophecy, and eventually, later on, there would be another great Jewish revolt that would end up being the last revolt and the last disaster under the man called in Aramaic Bar Kokhba, son of the star, whose messiahship was supported, at first reluctantly, by another great Jewish saint, Rabbi Akiba. Now here is a representation of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the Jewish king who took advice from the greatest prophet of his day, who was Isaiah, or Isaiah, as some people would say. The Assyrians, under King Sennacherib, were on their way to destroy Jerusalem and Judea, just as they had the northern kingdom of Israel, and they were grouping outside of Judea to do this. And Sennacherib had sent a communication to Hezekiah saying, "Don't trust in your God, don't trust in what he has to say, because look what I've done. I've wiped out all these other people with all their other gods. I'll wipe out you with all your gods too. And I wiped out Israel, you're next to go." And so Hezekiah sent to Isaiah, and Isaiah said, "Stand firm, the God of Israel says that you will be redeemed from this situation. And lo and behold, some kind of illness occurred, some kind of terrible plague occurred in the camp of King Sennacherib. And not only were thousands and thousands of his men died suddenly and very quickly, but soon after that, his own sons executed him and killed him. And the armies turned away, and Judea was saved. This is a representation of the prayer of Hezekiah, the great prayer that he made in this situation. Hezekiah had already paid a huge ransom, which had not been sufficient to keep the king from coming to overwhelm his kingdom and his city. And he received a letter that told him that they were coming now to conquer the city. And I'm quoting now from the 19th chapter of the book of 2 Kings. And Hezekiah went up into the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord God of Israel, which dwellest between the cherubim, thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. Lord, bow down thine ear and hear. Open, Lord, thine eyes and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, whom hath sent him to reproach the living God. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have destroyed the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods but the works of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Now, therefore, O Lord our God, I beseech thee, save thou us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord God, even thou only. And then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, and this is the way prophets speak the absolute truth, that which thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib king of Assyria I have heard. This is the word that the Lord hath spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee and laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee. Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed, and against whom hast thou exalted thy voice and lifted up thine eyes, etc. And he says that, therefore, I will defend this city, to save it for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib king of Assyria departed and went and returned and dwelt in Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that his sons smote him with the sword. So there are many great stories about Hezekiah, one of which is he became very sick unto death after this, and Isaiah was called, and Isaiah came in and gave him the pronouncement of God that he had only a short time to live, and he would be dying. And Hezekiah prayed again, and then as Isaiah was about to leave, he was struck again with another inspiration. He turned around and said, the Lord has heard your supplication and has now decided to add 15 years to your life. And in fact, Hezekiah recovered, and so on. So Hezekiah is a person who is thought of as one who has influence with God for the sake of the people and for the sake of Israel through his prayers and his supplications. So this is the kind of version of a Messiah that is not a conquering king like David was, that we find supported in many different traditions. Now let's take a look at the history of Messianic speculation. We're looking at the 2nd through the 1st centuries before the Christian era, the concept of the Messiah. In Hasidic mysticism, there is much said about the Messiah, and the term is used over and over again in the books of Enoch and the Testaments of the 12 patriarchs and the Psalms of Solomon. We do not find reference to the Messiah in most books of the wisdom tradition, like Tobit and Ben Sirach and so on. However, we do find it, of course, it's a major theme in Daniel and the book of Jubilees and various books of apocalyptic prophecy. Now, Israel's redemption was expected at the year 5000 after the creation. And we'll look more closely at this millennial expectation. It would bring the Messiah, not vice versa. In other words, the Messiah would not come and bring in the Messianic age. The Messianic age was preordained, and when it finally arrived, when the time finally arrived, then the anointed leader of Israel would come. So Jesus himself, even in his proclamation, as we read in the Gospel of Mark, says the time has been fulfilled, the season has been fulfilled, and that therefore he is expecting the Messianic age to begin, and that is the basis of his ministry and what he has to say. Not that I am the Messiah and I have come now, but that the age of the Messiah is upon us, and that is the very basic kernel of the message of Master Jesus. So this particular time in history was dated to the first quarter of the first century, the Christian era, by most rabbinic scholars, although there were debates about the date, but many people in popular expectation considered this to be the time. It was expected by apocalypticists about AD 30. And so there was a very big flurry of messianic expectation at this time. John the Baptist is saying, here it is, we're here, the time is here. Jesus is doing this. Theudas, who is considered to be a false Messiah, had raised large numbers of people, and there were many different messiahs at this time, or people who were proclaiming the coming of the Messiah. The militant zealots and Essenes, the Sicarii and sectarians, were busily working and plotting to kill or assassinate or turn over rule away from the temple establishment, and to prepare the way of the Messiah in their way by preparing for it politically. And of course their hopes were crushed by the destruction of Jerusalem, and finally the remnant of the army that held out at Masada in AD 72, where they all finally, almost 1,000 of them, all committed suicide rather than being taken captive by the Romans. So I've told you the story of Ben Zakkai, how the temple was destroyed, and then the religion itself, as a religion of the book, was established and saved by Ben Zakkai. The Pharisaic traditions were continued. The Sadduceic traditions came to a sudden end, and the Essenes came to a sudden end, and the Zealots came to a sudden end. And it was only through the Pharisaic traditions of Ben Zakkai that anything in Judaism was preserved. And then in another generation, we had the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was crushed by the Romans in about AD 135. And at that point, the Jews were expelled not just from Jerusalem and not just from having a temple, they were expelled from Palestine. It was illegal for Jews to dwell in Palestine, and that was the beginning of the modern diaspora, the wandering Jew. This is the beginning of the time of the sending out of Jews into Jewish communities in the Hellenistic world. To understand how this tradition continued in Israel, and it indeed did and still does continue, this is a book I recommend. It's called Messianic Speculation in Israel by Silverman, and you can learn a great deal about it by reading this. Masada, located around the Dead Sea, south of Jerusalem, a great tall high edifice upon which a fort was built, and in which the last of those who had started the great Jewish revolt and the Jewish war were now surrounded by the Roman troops. Looking down from the sky level, we can see how well they were protected. These are the remains of their forts. There were steep sides down on just about all directions. It was very difficult to get to that position. And it was at that place that they all willingly committed suicide and died, nearly 1,000 of them, rather than being captured by the Romans. And here's an interesting thing we find at Masada. This is a special bathing place to collect water for mikvah, because whether people were adherents of the Messiah ben David or the Messiah ben Joseph, of the violent Messiah who was warlike or the Messiah who was a prophetic man of peace, they all had in common baptism, that is to say mikvah, purifications. And these were very important to their kind of ritual and liturgy as opposed to temple ritual. So even the most violent of the Jewish revolutionaries were really using this whole new kind of means of purification, the mikvah, the baptism. Now, how was the Messianic age to be predicted or understood? Well, it was understood to be the year 5000 in the Jewish calendar. And this would be dated from the creation of the world. Although it was a little bit difficult to date, you could get very close, and rabbinic scholars knew that it was very close. It was in the first part of the first century of the Christian era. And it's the basis for Messianic speculation was the expectation of that time. In the Babylonian school of Daniel, which seems to have developed from or had much in common with or much owing to the school of Trito-Isaiah was associated with. From Deutero and Trito-Isaiah, who took the basic Proto-Isaiah themes of the perfected world, that would be a world that would be ruled by the true God, not just for Jews, but for all people. For all people would come to the temple and worship the one God. And this material that we find in the book of Isaiah became a kind of template for the Christian book of Revelations, the Apocalypse of John. And fit into this were the other prophetic ideas of the day of Yahweh as a day of mishpat, a day of judgment. And that was interpreted in terms of the tribulations of Israel under Rome. And so it was thought that there would be a period of what we call the birth pangs of the Messiah, when there would be great, great suffering, just like the birth of a woman. Before the child comes out, she goes through a great agony and suffering. So I'm going to read some things from the first and second century Jewish apocalyptic tradition. I want to read a little bit first about what Silverman has to say about this period and the idea of the coming of the Messianic age at the year 5000 in the Jewish calendar. Silverman says that for some centuries, first among Jews, later among Christians, the date of the coming of the Messiah was debated, but it's evident that the people of the first and early part of the second centuries had an approximate idea of their place in the age of the creation cycle, and that they were very near the age 5000, the year 5000. The rabbis generally believed, on the basis of the biblical creation week, that, quote, the world will last 6,000 years and will be in chaos 1,000 years. And this we find in Talmudic literature. The 1,000 years prior to the destruction of the world, that would be from 5,000 to 6,000, would be the years of consummation and universal blessedness. Now, when we read from the Talmud, we hear some of the ideas of the rabbis at the time of Jesus about a Messiah. Now, the book of 4th Ezra, which is written during the 1st century of the Christian era, the closing chapter of this is called the Apocalypse of Ezra. He gives a very explicit date. Quote, "And I did so in the 7th year of the 6th week of 5,000 years of the creation, and 3 months and 12 days. So he anticipated the swift approach of the consummation of the times. And the writer of the original source of 4th Ezra, living about 35 years after the destruction of the temple, believed in the imminent collapse of the Roman Empire and the speedy restoration of Israel. So the final redactor of Ezra, who lived in the early age of Hadrian, about AD 120, expected the Messiah to come during or directly after the reign of this emperor, and this was the basis of the second great Jewish revolt by Bar Kokhba that failed. The book of 2nd Baruch, which was composed in the latter half of the first Christian century, expresses the same thought. Quote, "For truly my redemption has drawn nigh, and is not far distant as aforetime. And at that time, after a little interval, Zion will again be builded. Quote, for the youth of the world is past, and the strength of the creation already exhausted, and the advent of the times is very short, and the pitcher is near to the cistern, and the ship to the port." In the 28th chapter, 2nd Baruch, the writer seems even to give a date, which is a little bit hard to decipher. Quote, "For the measure and reckoning of that time are 2 parts of a week of 7 days. Even Josephus gives clear indications that the people of his generation took their age to be the close of the 5th millennium. In his book of Antiquities, which gives an historical account from creation to the year 66 of the Christian era, covers an itemized period of approximately 5,000 years. And he wrote the first book of Contra Appionem to substantiate his claim of the great antiquity of the Jewish people. And he writes, quote, "Those antiquities contain the history of 5,000 years and are taken out of our sacred books." So Josephus represented pretty much the accepted Pharisaic view of his day. So that the rabbis, immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem, believing themselves to be in the final cycle of the 5th millennium, thought that the, quote, days of the Messiah would last 40, 60, or 70 years, and expected the Messiah to come during the 2nd century within the first half of that time. And the Messianic age was to begin at a time when the fortunes of the people were at their lowest ebb. And then they write, quote, "On the day when the temple was destroyed, the Messiah was born." So these were the ideas that were had about the coming of the Messiah, that it was linked to and based upon the time that had passed, the cycles of time. And these cycles were not astrological necessarily, although they were interpreted that way later by Gentile Christians, but they were based on the idea of the 7 days of creation in the book of Genesis, and that after the 6th day there would be perfection on the 6th day in the 6th millennium, and then at the end there would be rest, and then the universe would be created again. And one of the interesting things to look at is the prophecy of Daniel in the context of Josephus. I'm going to read from Silver's book, Messianic Speculation in Israel. He says that from the 1st century, we also have the testimony of Josephus that the book of Daniel was held to contain prophecies concerning the ultimate redemption from the Roman yoke. In his Antiquities, he writes, Quote, "In the very same manner Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate." Now, Josephus also seems to have known of a definite interpretation of the beasts and the times visions of Daniel, which, however, he quite deliberately withholds from his readers. Quote, "Daniel did also declare the meaning of the stone to the king, but I do not think proper to relate it, since I have only undertaken to describe things past or things present, but not things of the future. Yet if anyone be so very desirous of knowing truth as not to waive such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of futurity, and whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which you will find among the sacred writings." And the author of 4th Ezra also says, "The eagle which they saw come up from the sea," that's in the prophecy of Daniel, "is the fourth kingdom which appeared in vision to thy brother Daniel," and so on. Now, the early Christians just as well refer back to these Jewish beliefs. St. Augustine preserves the tradition that Jesus was born in the year 5000. Theophilus, who is a Christian chronologer, traces 5,529 years from creation to the birth of Jesus, and also Hippolytus and Clement of Alexandria and Julius Africanus preserve the tradition that he was born about the year 5,500. Quote, "For the Jews have handed down to us by their extant Hebrew histories the number 5,500 years as the period up to the advent of the word of salvation that was announced to the world in the time of the sway of the Caesars." And of course the rabbis then found it necessary to counter this by asserting that the claim is false because the 6th millennium is still far off. And then this kind of argument went back and forth between the Jews and the Christians. In any case, we can see that in Rabbinic Judaism, there was a very definite expectation that the Messianic age was going to be here. It was had just about arrived, and with that, it would bring the Messiah. And then who and what the Messiah might be was the question, not whether the Messianic age was beginning. And to this, we have to add that in the Talmudic literature, we find that most of the apocalyptic rabbis, that is, the rabbis who believed in the Messianic age being almost upon us, we find described as Merkaba mystics. These were people who undertook the mystic ascent to the throne of God, which we know was done by early Christians and by Yeshua. Now there were different views of what the Anointed One might be, what the Messiah of God might be. There were those who saw the Messiah as a military leader. These were the Jewish sectarian reformers, like the Zadokites, who had broken away from the temple establishment because they believed that the wrong priesthood was put into place, and eventually the Zadokites were kind of the ancestors of what would become the Sadducees. All the sects whose literature is preserved in the scriptorium at Qumran, were believed in a militant solution. They believed that there would be a military leader, that the Messiah would be a military leader who would lead them in a great battle of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. The Essenes were among these people. The Pharisees themselves believed the Messiah was a son of David, and like David, he would lead warfare against specifically the Romans. And the Zealots were the extreme flank of this wing of belief. But there were also those who were convinced that the Messiah would not be a man of war. The Messiah would be a man of peace, and he would be a prophetic Messiah or a wise man or a saint. This point of view was more characteristic of Babylonian Judaism. In fact, in the Babylonian Talmud, which is earlier than the Palestinian Talmud, we find really very little concern about revolt against authorities and a Jewish revolution and this sort of thing, and a Messiah coming and overturning the world, because the Jews of Babylon had long ago adapted to their situation, were happy with their rulers, and did not have the kind of pressures put upon them that the Roman occupation of Palestine had put upon the Palestinians. So many of the mystic schools were supporters of the point of view that we really find expressed in the teachings of Yeshua. The school of Trito-Isaiah, the Babylonian school of Daniel, which saw the beasts of the earlier sovereignties of the earth being overcome by a humane political sovereignty. The wisdom schools of Hellenistic Judaism were not involved in a great deal of messianic speculation, but their ideals were that of Jewish martyrdom and of Israel as a kind of prophetic unity, a kind of voice in the world for all mankind. And so the kind of expression you find from Josephus and others trying to show that the Jews are really the light of the world for the Gentiles is the kind of thing that we find expressed in the wisdom schools, and their concept of one anointed from God would be as a great teacher, or as one who would teach the Gentiles and change the ways that they operated. And eventually this came up into a sort of view of two kinds of messiahs. And this is kind of a later synthesis, but this is what prophets or what the scholars would refer to as the two kinds of Messiah. This is a simplified view. There was the Messiah ben David, the Messiah who was identified as being the son of David, and he would operate like David, and he would be a militant and a military leader, a warrior. And then there was the Messiah ben Joseph. And the Messiah ben Joseph represented the prophetic leader, the mystic, and all the parts of that were assigned to him, not only wisdom and all this, but also martyrdom and suffering. So these are the two kinds of Messiah that were interpreted at this time. Now, if we look at the Messianic schools of thought, this is how they sort of fell out in this period of time. Those who were in the camp of the Messiah ben David were not all united in what they expected and when they expected things. Some of them were far more militant. Some believed that military force was necessary now, and guerrilla action now, and guerrilla resistance now, and they were emboldened by the coming of the age. Others believed that they should wait for a great figure to emerge. But these would include the Palestinian Jews in general, the Galilean zealots, the zealots of Galilee who had actually been energized by the terrible killings and persecutions of the Herodian rulers earlier. The Judean Sicarii, who were the assassins who believed that they could hasten the process by assassinating. They would be in a crowd of people and have a killing kind of knife concealed under their robes, and they would come close to somebody who they considered to be an enemy of the Jewish people or of the temple or of an enemy of the true temple and so on. Or a representative of Roman persecution, and they would stab him real quick, put the knife back inside their cloak, and fade into the crowd. They were the assassins, the Sicarii. And all the communities that we find represented in the scrolls of Qumran, or at least most of them, and the Pharisees themselves were committed to various shades of militancy on the idea of the Messiah ben David. The Zadokites we've mentioned before, various rebel groups. But then who were the people or who were the groups that expected a Messiah ben Joseph, a very different kind of Messiah? Well, first of all, we would have to say Babylonian Jews, Babylonian Judaism, which was in an entirely different political situation than Palestinian Judaism. And they were in a settled condition. They were happy with their finances, their economics, their place in society. In fact, Babylon was a very, very thriving capital of Judaism long after it was no longer a capital of the Seleucid cities. It was still a great Jewish center, and we find that the early Christians sent missionaries to Babylon very early on because there were so many Jews there. There were Havurot, or guilds, or religious groups in Galilee who had a very different orientation, much influenced by the trade and the connection with Babylon, because there was indeed a connection through the trade routes from Galilee to Babylon. And there was more contact between that point of view. And remember that Galilee was looked down upon by Judea. It was the old Samaritan, the old Samaria, the old defeated Israel. And so they were looked down upon as bumpkins and people who were perhaps heretical and outside of the pale. And they really had closer spiritual connections with their Babylonian relatives. In the wisdom schools, although not much is said specifically about a Messiah, there is much that is attributed to the learning and the discipleship of the Ruach HaKodesh, or of wisdom herself, Chachma, and the tutoring of God, of those who would attune themselves to them, through the prophets, and through their own direct connection with God, that there was a lot of support for the idea of a Messiah ben Joseph in these schools. And then, of course, in the really extreme schools of mysticism, and the Galilee was famous for its mystic prophets who lived in the wild and ate berries and uttered prophecies and so on. John the Baptist was associated with this kind of thought. There is much that connects John the Baptist with the Essene schools and many of the scrolls in Qumran. But the most important thing to know about John the Baptist is how his legend was carried forward into history, because that's where you're going to get an insight into what his thought really was. And what we have preserved of the teachings of John tell us that he was there to purify the people, to prepare them for the coming of a Messiah, not necessarily a militant Messiah. So it's not really clear that John the Baptist, although he's definitely much more connected with the asceticism of the Essenes than he is of some of the other schools we could connect him with, like the wisdom schools. He definitely, I think, falls under this category of expecting a Messiah ben Joseph. And if we look at the what we have preserved in the teachings and writings of the Mandeans, and the Mandean gnosis and the gnosis of the Manda, uh, the gnosis of life, and so on, I think we find this point of view is that which is expressed from that root. And probably the Alexandrian Jews were very much in this camp as well, because again, they were happy in their environment, they were doing well. It's the Palestinians who were really in bad shape. And there were many Essenes who were not in favor of this kind of warfare. In fact, many of the Essenes didn't really get involved in fighting the Romans until rather late in the game, although some of them gave funds and money to the freedom fighters, etc. They were not themselves organized in that kind of way, but of course eventually they were connected with it, and their cities and their camps were utterly destroyed by the Romans. And then there were other sects that were related to Judaism and loosely to Judaism, mostly to Hellenistic Judaism, like, for example, the Therapeutai, the healers of the Egyptian deserts, who again were mystics, and we don't know exactly what their ideas might have been, but Therapeutai and Dosithias and so on were not militants. Now here's a map of Jerusalem and Judea, and then to the north we have the Galilee, and to the south we have the Judean desert, and so on. The Babylonian school of Daniel, which seems to derive from the apocalyptic ideas of Trito-Isaiah, did not have any social pressure for military revolt. And we don't find, as I said in the Babylonian Talmud, the kind of grinding of the teeth expectation for justice coming into the world through violent revolution that we find in the Palestinians. And that influence was very strongly connected with Galilee. So I'm going to use the color purple to represent this school of the Messiah ben Joseph, which has a lot of relations to Galilee and the Galilean people, although Galilee was also known as the home of the Zealots, who were very strongly militant. But the Palestinian schools were under extreme pressure for military revolt because of the situation with the Romans. So we're going to put a red star over here to represent the viewpoint of the Messiah ben David, the militant military conqueror. And this whole area in the desert is places where militants fought their final battles, for example, at Masada and things like this, and we find the Qumran scrolls and all the kind of militant the evidence of the militancy from that era. But you have to understand that the concept of the Messiah ben David was spread throughout, and very strongly throughout the Galilee, especially through those who were in favor of not even a king of Israel, but of a theocracy, of returning to the oldest form of government, no government. It wasn't quite anarchy, but the theocrats of the Zealot movement were kind of a combination of religious fundamentalists and very proactive guerrilla fighters. And so there was a very, very strong contingent of them in the Galilee, but it wasn't necessarily by any means the whole population. Now, if we look at the sources for the messianic concepts that were used by Mar Yeshua, this is what we find. We find that he and the early Christians depended very much upon Trito Isaiah and that school, the sort of the lion lies down with the lamb school, beating our swords into plowshares and into pruning hooks and this sort of thing. And that's where an awful lot of the apocalyptic understanding of the New Jerusalem comes from in the Messianic age. And we find a lot of selections from the Trito Isaiah's description of Israel as the suffering servant, and many martyrdom traditions, the traditions of the martyrdom of Eleazar and of Taxo and so on, which are too numerous for us to go into here. But if you go into Second Temple literature and the martyrdom traditions, martyrdom didn't begin with Christianity. Martyrdom was a Jewish institution for centuries before Christianity came about. And Jewish martyrs who withstood horrible tortures and their bodies were racked and they would not recant and they would not renounce their God were the backbone of the tradition that became Christian martyrdom. And that was very important in the traditions of Yeshua. The Bar Enosh, the Son of Man as it's called, apocalyptic vision of Daniel. And the vision of Daniel is that the world is ruled by beasts, and there are different kinds of beasts, and there are many different horns, and this beast has a horn, and this beast takes over that, and another beast takes over another beast. And the world is under the sovereignty of evil. It is under the sovereignty of the evil forces of great rulers. And this all comes from the time of Alexander the Great and all the Hellenistic kings that developed and the taxation that they exacted from everyone and so on. But that a time would come when God himself would elevate one like unto a son of man, meaning one like unto a human being rather than like unto a beast, into a position of rulership, and that humane and just government and sovereignty would be put in place upon the earth. And that was the political part of this vision. The Messianic age was an age when there would be a just government that would resemble a true human and humane government, as opposed to the government of the beasts that had gone before. And we find descriptions of the Messiah in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs and a lot of earlier literature. We do not find in the teaching of Jesus a kind of concepts that are contained in the first century militant Messiah ben David apocalyptic views like we find in 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch and so on. So when we want to ask ourselves about Yeshua's view of the Messiah, we have to look at the fact that he had a very specific view within the context of these different ideas. He had a view of the Messiah that was essentially prophetic. He himself, like many of the rabbis, was familiar with the Masa Merkaba, which meant the work of the Merkaba, and the Kabbalah, with the oral traditions, Jewish traditions, probably that came through Babylon and Galilee. One of the images that is very important to him that we find in lots of his parables and becomes important in Christian mysticism is that of the Messianic marriage banquet. We read of that at the very beginning, quoted from Isaiah at the beginning of this section, about the great banquet that would be spread out by God for all the people, and all the people would be invited. Now this banquet in Jewish marriage and a Jewish wedding was given for people in the community to celebrate the wedding. It was an open thing that people would come to, and there were certain conventions about it, but it represented a great feast or celebration that was offered to everyone, and the poor could come and they could take what was left and they could eat their fill and so on. Now, in the Isaiah scheme of things, as we go into Deutero and Trito-Isaiah, we have the theme of what we call the suffering servant. This is a figure who represents probably Israel as a whole, but later gets applied to the individual saints and martyrs who suffers for the religion of Israel and for the name of God. And then we also have the theme of the Son of Man, the Bar Enosh, the Babylonian Son of Man that we read about in the school of Daniel. and in this prophecy, one like unto a Bar Enosh, a son of man, one like unto the offspring of humanity, as opposed to the offspring of beasts, comes before the throne and is offered an eternal sovereignty on the earth. And in this kind of a view, we are not looking at a Davidic king, that is, a king who is the son of David. We're looking at another kind of a figure that's not necessarily a political ruler or political sovereign. We find one of the earliest and most and undoubtedly authentic interactions that Jesus has with the Palestinian scribes as he comes out of the Galilee and brings his view of things against their view of things and has various kinds of debates with them. He asks them, why do you say that Messiah is David's son? When, and then he quotes the Psalms. In the Psalms, David himself calls him Lord. So Jesus is disputing this idea of the Messiah as the son of David. Rather, it is someone that David would refer to as Lord or call Lord. So the Bar Enosh is a coming human being or humanity. It's not necessarily a one man or one person, but a humanity, a coming humanity. It's an anointed or Christed humanity that will rule at the right hand of God. That is, he will rightly, or that this humanity will rightly exercise the sovereignty that God exercises, and will establish just and humane political government upon the earth. And that is not necessarily an individual person or individual being. That's not necessarily a person who's going to come and do all this. Now, if we look at the proclamation that Yeshua made about the Messianic age, we find that he is proclaiming that the season is ripe. The word in Greek is kairos. It means the season or the seasonal time. And this refers to undoubtedly the period of time after the creation of the earth as understood by biblical interpreters of the Old Testament scripture. And this period of the end of the fifth millennium is like the end of the fifth day in creation. And it's understood to be Kabbalistically the time when mankind is created. On the sixth day, God creates man. He breathes his spirit into him. And so a new kind of mankind is going to be created. God is going to create this kind of mankind. And this idea is rife in the earliest, most authentic Christian teachings that we find, which are those from Paul. Paul was very deeply schooled in the details of the ideas of Jesus, because remember, it was 14 years before he went out on his own and started his missionary journeys, between the time he had his vision and then was taken in by disciples in Damascus. And he says that he did not confer with flesh and blood, but spent 14 years in the wilderness. Well, this is probably quite an exaggeration, but it's undoubtedly true that he learned the teachings of the Master Jesus from other people, because they were not written down and he was not a disciple of Jesus. So he learned what he knew and understood about this. And when he speaks of the first Adam and the second Adam, the old Adam and the new Adam, the old mankind and the new mankind, he is speaking very much theologically, rabbinically speaking, about the teachings of Jesus, who taught about a coming of a new kind of humanity. Now, people needed to prepare for this messianic age, this time. John the Baptist told people they needed to purify themselves and prepare themselves, because the messianic age was coming upon them. And how did the purity come? The purity came through submission to the divine way, through nacham, which is very unfortunately translated in English as repentance, and in Greek even as metanoia. But nacham means submission of the lower to the higher, submission of the old Adam to the new Adam. And purity comes through that act. And in the case of John the Baptist, a person was purified by mikvah, by going through the water. He was reborn by going through the water, and he made a renewal of his covenant and became the new people of God. And just as at the 50th year of every Jubilee in the ideal prophetic version of Israel, where all debts and all things of any sort would be forgiven and people would start clean and new again, so at the end of this 5,000 year period, there would be forgiveness. There would be complete forgiveness and wiping out of sins for those who would accept that this was the situation, and those who would enter into the Messianic age. So forgiveness was a terribly important thing. All debts were forgiven. Didn't matter who you are, what you are. You had a new start now. You could begin again. All claim to debt is released, and therefore, in order for you to have your debt released, you must release your claim to the debts that others owe you. Release us from our debts as we forgive those who are our debtors. And that was the prayer of Jesus that was taught. A very important concept, that is the way this happens. Discipleship becomes the central modality, because what is happening here, in order to purify, in order to gain entrance into this new Malkuth, this new sovereignty of God, one has to adopt a way of life, a walk of life. One has to have to now live after the way of God and to accept the way of God. And this was discipleship. And in this discipleship, there was a renewal of the covenant, of the covenantal fidelity or faithfulness, which we look at with the word amen, which unfortunately is translated in the King James and ever since as belief. It has nothing to do with believing at all. It has to do with fidelity, faithfulness, or it's a renewal of covenantal faithfulness to God's walk. Halakha, Jesus said, follow my walk, to God's walk or way. Now, there are many prophetic concepts in the messianic teachings of Moriah.